and feared in their own time. They were ancient warriors who invented the boot camp, the frontal assault, state-sponsored education, and a lifestyle and aesthetic that, to this day, bears their name. They are the Spartans, and this is their story. From the 8th to the 5th centuries BC, Sparta was the envy of ancient Greece, a collection of several hundred, often combative, city-states.
Most Greeks admired the Spartans and feared them. They did not find it very comforting when a Spartan army, even a small one, arrived anywhere near their territory because of the reputation the Spartans had as soldiers.
The mere sight of the Spartan war machine sent many foes running for the hills. When battles were fought, they routinely involved small numbers and lasted only a matter of days. However, early in the 5th century BC, all that changed with a massive invasion from the east. Persia, a vast empire hungry to expand, steamrolled into Greece with a colossal army some 200,000 strong. But the Greeks, led by Sparta, gamely rose to the challenge. In 480 BC, 300 Spartan soldiers made an immortal stand at Thermopylae, inspiring a nation and tipping the balance of war. Then, 1 year later, on the fields of Plataea, the Spartans crushed the Persian infantry in one of the bloodiest days in history. General Pausanias and the legendary Spartan warriors under his command were hailed as heroes. Still, as the few surviving Persian troops limped home, the Greeks could only wonder, when would they fight again?
They hadn't destroyed Persian power. They hadn't destroyed the Persian Empire. They hadn't taken away the Persian money, the vast troops that they had. So any sensible Greek would have had to consider the possibility that there would be more trouble from the Persians.
The Greeks, who rarely agreed on anything, had created a shaky alliance to take on the Persians, one they managed to preserve under the leadership of Pausanias. But in 477 BC, Pausanias was replaced by an Athenian. Sparta was happy to step down as head of the Greek alliance and return to its role as hegemon, or leader of the Peloponnesian League, a loosely aligned confederation of city-states in southern Greece.
The Spartans seemed absolutely bound and determined to retreat from any kind of global role. They just basically seemed to see their only real future as Peloponnesian-based, as going back, running their league, and that's that.
Then there were the Messenians. Sparta had conquered Messenia some 200 years earlier and created a class of agricultural serfs called helots. But the helots outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 10 to 1, and rebellion was a way of life. Meanwhile, Sparta and Athens remained on good terms, despite a checkered past.
The number one politician in Athens was Cimon, who was friend of the Spartans beyond all belief. The Spartans trusted Cimon, therefore they didn't worry too much about the Athenians. Everything was going pretty well.
Cimon had great respect for the Spartans and their unwavering commitment to discipline and obedience. But fellow Athenian aristocrats who ruled the city did not think Sparta could be counted on if the Persians attacked again.
The perception emerged that Sparta was a great threat. Likewise, the Spartans from early on felt that Athens now threatened them, threatened their dependencies and their allies abroad.
So Athens began building its own formidable alliance, named the Delian League, after the sacred island of Delos, where the League's treasury was kept. Members included city-states to the north, most of the Aegean islands, and the city-states on the western coast of Asia Minor, formerly under Persian control. Athens demanded loyalty from its allies, and payment of a heavy tribute to supply and maintain the Navy.
The League had to compel some states who didn't want to join on the grounds that you couldn't be a free rider. We were bringing you freedom from Persia. We were preserving freedom of the seas and what could allow you to get rich. You have to contribute.
The Athenian Navy's relentless patrol of Greek waters succeeded in eliminating the Persian threat. Almost immediately, several members of the Delian League wanted out.
The Athenians and the other allies reacted the way Lincoln and the North did when the South felt that would be a good idea and said, no, you don't, and they used force to suppress those rebellions. So gradually, the Athenian Navy got stronger, the allies got weaker, and this was turning into an Athenian empire.
In fact, by 465 BC, the Athenians rivaled the Spartans in muscle and influence. With its commanding naval presence, Athens ruled the seas, while Sparta's celebrated army was unbeatable on land. Two power blocks with two very different ideologies. Sparta demanded that the city-states in the Peloponnesian League establish oligarchies, ruled by a privileged few. Delian League members were expected to embrace democracy. The two Greek giants were on a collision course for war when the unexpected happened.
There is an earthquake that erupts in Spartan territory, kills a large number of Spartans. The Helots of Messenia take advantage of this natural disaster to rise up in rebellion.
More than 1,000 Spartan men died in the earthquake, leaving only 9,000 hoplites to quell the uprising. Desperate, they turned to their friend Cimon for help. At great personal risk, he managed to convince a reluctant Athenian assembly to commit troops to Sparta.
The Athenians send down a large army, a land army, ready to help the Spartans against their Helots. The Athenians show up, and the Spartans say, gee, we've changed our minds.
And the Spartans then respond in this really extraordinary way with this terrific insult of sending that army packing, of sending them back home. And why they did this is because they were terrified and scandalized by what they saw. They saw these democratic Athenians walking around in an open and free way, and these Athenians asking, hey, how come you guys have enslaved the Helots? Don't you know you're not supposed to enslave other Greeks?
And this really is the moment in which it's pretty clear that the two sides are not going to be friendly.
The humiliating rejection by the Spartans outraged the Athenian assembly, further reducing the influence of old-line aristocrats. Cimon was made the scapegoat and ostracized from Athens for 10 years as punishment. Back in Sparta, the Messenian revolt raged on for another 2 years. Finally, in 462 BC, the Helots were contained. But more trouble was brewing to the north, where Athens continued its rapid expansionism by concluding alliances with Thessaly and Argos.
That must have terrified the Spartans. Their ancient Argive rivals are now democrats. So the Spartans were worried in two ways about democracy. One was what it might do to their own society if that notion crept in, and two, how it might hurt their foreign relations because democracies were likely to join with democracies.
In 459 BC, Athens and Sparta finally came to blows. However, the so-called First Peloponnesian War quickly turned into nothing more than a series of raids and counter-raids on opposing allies.
Sometimes it's a hot war, and there are actually military battles that are fought. Sometimes it's a cold war, and there's simply skirmishes on both sides. It's never fought totally.
Meanwhile, leadership shifted from Cimon to a wealthy Athenian named Pericles. Pericles was born into politics, and he would be a dominant force in Athens for the next 30 years. One of Pericles' pivotal gambits was to take over the Delian League's treasury, which had been originally under the control of the allies.
In the middle of the 5th century, the Athenians moved this treasury from Delos back to Athens. And that was the crucial moment, I think, that when we saw that the Athenians were really taking charge.
Suddenly, flush with wealth, Pericles embarked on a public building program, the scale, cost, and magnificence of which had never before been seen. And so began the great flowering of Athenian culture, known as the Golden Age. In a sweeping, spare-no-expense building program, Pericles first had the long walls from the city to the port of Piraeus completed, a move designed to withstand any future siege. Athens soon became an island of invincible fortification, importing food and supplies from Crimea and Egypt, her powerful navy poised to repel any Spartan attempt to threaten supply lines.
It's a commercial centre as well as a naval, military centre. So the Athenians had, so long as they controlled Piraeus and the access to it, they were pretty much secure from their grain supply being interrupted.
Pericles also ordered work to begin on the temple complex atop the Acropolis, destroyed 30 years earlier by the marauding Persian army.
Much of the optimism of Athenian culture in the 5th century comes from the victory over the Persians, which is the classical period of Greek culture, the period of heroic sculpture, of the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, of the comedies of Aristophanes, of the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides.
The brilliant philosophers Socrates and Plato were also products of the time. But perhaps the most spectacular achievement of all was the Parthenon, or House of the Virgin Goddess. Housed inside this magnificent marble structure was a giant ivory and gold sculpture of Athena, believed to be the divine champion of Athenian military power. If built today, the Parthenon would cost over $500 million, and it has endured as the masterpiece of Greek architecture. Under the astute leadership of Pericles, Athens became the center of intellectual and cultural life in the Aegean. A glittering city of some 60,000 citizens, it stood in stark contrast to grim Sparta, where the mounting influence of its neighbor to the northeast was cause for great alarm.
I think the Spartans, when they see Athens as a rising power, the first thing they think is kill it, swat it, destroy it. We can't have rising powers. We can't have competitors.
And so, by the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states in Greece, were on the verge of full-scale war. By 450 BC, the balance of power had shifted from Sparta to Athens, where the Golden Age blossomed in all its splendor. In Sparta, however, this display of extravagance was greeted with fear and suspicion. More and more, the Spartans were feeling threatened by Athens' growing power.
The Spartans are always very arrogant people, and for the Spartans, it's really important to be able to thrust their chest out and say, I'm number one, I'm top dog, and nobody else is top dog.
To hammer home that point, the Spartan army invaded Attica in 446 BC, and shortly after, the Athenians offered a truce. The 30 years' peace was agreed upon by both sides the next year, and with it, the First Peloponnesian War ended. Sparta was content to turn inward, much as the United States did following World War I. However, over the next 10 years, the Athenians continued to interfere with the members of the Peloponnesian League, practically baiting Sparta out of its isolationism.
Athens went all over the place, up in Macedonia and Thrace and in the Aegean islands, and crushed smaller cities and settlements that were friendly to Sparta. This was naturally perceived by the Spartans as the first but unmistakable steps of marching against Sparta itself.
The Corinthians, really one of Sparta's most important allies, are absolutely convinced that Athens intends to break the Peloponnesian League to become the imperial hegemon of the entire Aegean. But the Spartans constantly pull back. They're not eager to take on these Athenians. It's not going to be an easy war. They're clear on that. The Athenians have a navy that they can't imagine confronting. Sparta simply doesn't have an effective navy to respond with.
Building and manning a formidable navy took vast amounts of capital, and the Spartans had long rejected any form of money, believing it led to inequality at home and needless temptations from the outside.
They don't even have coinage of their own. So a fleet of 200 ships has 40,000 men apart from Marines, that is to say from hoplites who serve with the fleet. That's a lot of human beings to be fed. The Athenians have a system for raising that money in order to support the fleet. The Spartans have nothing of the sort.
And so Sparta remained defiant, refusing to be dragged into war. But the Spartans were forced to listen when the members of the Peloponnesian League called an emergency meeting in 432 BC. Many cities denounced Athens to the allies assembled at Sparta. By doing nothing, they said, the Spartans were encouraging the Athenians to commit further acts of aggression.
Therefore, discontent, distrust arose along with the sentiment that this could be settled only by war and not through peaceful negotiations.
Sparta's stated aim in ending the 30 Years' peace was to liberate Greece by restoring autonomy to Greek states subject to Athens. The Spartan strategy was simple: march on Attica and engage the Athenians in a land battle.
And so they mobilized probably the biggest single army that the Peloponnesian League has ever fielded. It may have been 50 to 60,000 men. And in late spring of 431, they march northward through the isthmus up to the Megarian plain, and they go into the plain of Attica.
This was the infamous Spartan war machine that enemies so feared, and Pericles was determined to avoid a head-to-head battle. Instead, he came up with a two-pronged strategy: offense by sea, defense by land. At sea, the Athenian navy set sail with 100 warships called triremes. Their mission? To conduct covert raids on the Peloponnesus. On land, Pericles' plan was more controversial. In fact, it was a totally unconventional approach to war.
Pericles' strategy was this. It was to avoid, at all costs, the standard way of fighting a war. A battle between hoplites of one side against hoplites of the other.
Pericles decides to evacuate the 200,000 acres of Attica and send its population of farmers with their families, perhaps over 100,000 altogether, inside the walls of Athens, and to ride out these invasions on the premise that Athens can be supplied by sea.
We've got a secure port. We've got massive walls around our city. We can import all the food we want. We can keep control of our empire.
They could do that because they could collect money from their imperial empire. They could maintain a fleet. They could rule the seas. It was all perfect.
Well, Spartan has no tradition of siegecraft, so they're not going to be able to breach the walls of Athens. But they have this tradition of Greek warfare that you march into an enemy's sacred land. It's an affront to their masculinity, it's an affront to their sovereignty, it's an affront to their national pride, and you hack away a few olive trees, you burn a few acres of grain, and the enraged farmers in their frenzy come out to meet you on a plain, and then you wipe them out, and the issue is settled.
But the Athenians refused to budge. Instead, they remained barricaded inside the city, further protected by separate walls, including the long walls that extended nearly 5 miles to the harbor at Piraeus.
The Spartans are pretty much bamboozled by this. This isn't good. And this basically leaves the Spartans with no response. The Spartan system was based on when we move into your territory, you move out, and we chop you to ribbons.
Frustrated, the Spartans continued to pillage the fields of Attica, an area the size of Rhode Island. But Sparta was ill-equipped to resupply such a massive army. So, waiting for the Athenians to come out and fight, was simply not an option. 1 month after their arrival, the despondent troops packed up and headed for home.
The first year, Pericles seems a genius, but he didn't count on the idea that a city that was designed to house perhaps 75 to 125,000 inhabitants was ill-equipped in the summer months to house 250 or 300,000 inhabitants. It doesn't have the sewage facilities, it doesn't have the water facilities, it doesn't have the housing.
Pericles' biggest miscalculation, however, had nothing to do with sanitation or overcrowding.
Where he went wrong was in underestimating the effect on morale of being in effect cowardly. Going behind your walls, seeing the Spartans come and doing nothing. That went against the grain of the Greek code of